in 2010 said that we must try to hold global average temperatures below 2 degrees against pre-industrial levels. Pre-industrial, by the way, typically taken to mean something as before 1850, but there's a bit of discrepancy on that. More recently, many of you, of course, know in the Paris Agreement, this was revised to 1.5 degrees. What we first thought was the boundary between safe and dangerous, 2 degrees, we now think is probably going to be about 1.5 degrees. So the consensus has changed a little bit. So this is kind of the backdrop against which people set carbon budgets. If we think on a global level, the idea of a carbon budget is a little bit simpler. Because of course, if we're going to hold temperature rise to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, there is a set amount of carbon we can release on a planetary level whilst that remains so. The recent special report by the IPCC on 1.5 degrees, they reckon we've got 420 gigatons of CO2 left. A completely nebulous number that means very little to anyone, right? That equates to, if we continued emitting carbon at the levels we do today, that would be all gone by 2028. However, the story gets a little bit bleaker when you acknowledge the fact that lots of people dispute these numbers, and some people think we've even blown our chance of 1.5 degrees already. Also, the numbers in this report are based on that idea that we can suck carbon out of the atmosphere, called net negative emissions technologies, and the kind of precedent for using them at the scale required is not really been set. So this is a bit of a gamble what they're proposing there. So something slightly problematic in the backdrop of this. I think this is quite powerful. I said, of course, that negative emissions technologies are about sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, and they essentially buy more time. So the more we can do that, the longer we get to continue emitting carbon and essentially not taking the level of action required. But as I say, these are a huge gamble. I don't think we should bargain on these particularly. So this provides the impetus simply to act now. Now, for me, the more complicated question, as if that wasn't complicated enough, is how we divide this planetary budget up. We know there's a set amount of emissions for the planet to prevent dangerous warming, whatever that number may be, but how much does Manchester get? How much does the UK get? How much do notionally less developed nations get? And that is a very complex, and I would argue, value-based decision. I don't think science particularly has the answers on this one. If you look at historic emissions in the world, you can see that from this territorial-based approach, so not even considering consumption, the United States and Europe, which is this blue bit and the purple bit, have contributed to over half of historical emissions. So that's pretty huge. Now, Kevin Anderson, who I'm sure many of you have heard from before, and his colleague Alice Larkin was Bose back then, have remarked that because there is so little wiggle room to stay within 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees, that there's now no option but to ignore what we've done in the past when allowing ourselves carbon budgets. By their understanding, if we were to acknowledge our role in historical emissions, we would have to be zero carbon now. So there's no way we can really pay off this debt. And that is pretty bleak, right? I don't think any self-respecting city should be parading its carbon budget around as a good thing. This is something we've got to do kind of with our heads down a little bit. We're responsible for this in the past, and we are constraining the budget of other nations. So I think this is actually quite powerful the more you think of it. This is a massive massive geopolitical gesture to say that we should go on emitting at all. The other thing I want to point out is, of course, most of these carbon budgets are underpinned by one of those ways of taking carbon footprints, kind of carbon footprint metrics that I mentioned earlier. So carbon budgets are typically underpinned by that territorial-based perspective that I said earlier. This is a pretty neat diagram, which I appreciate is probably too small for anyone in this room to read. This is a diagram of the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance. So this is cities that have developed a kind of carbon neutral budget, a way of moving towards so-called zero carbon. And if you look at their policies, which is what the authors of this paper did, you soon realise that they are all shaped up around reducing energy and reducing direct emissions, maybe reducing emissions from waste. The point I'm making here is that the focus on territorial-based footprints in both inventories, so the carbon footprints, and budgets has resulted in climate change action plans that tend to neglect the role of investment and consumption too. So this is there. This is one of the issues with it. I also, as I mentioned in response to Claire's comment earlier, that I find the idea of zero carbon slightly problematic. Zero carbon, of course, for Greater Manchester and Manchester, both taking aim at around about 2038 or similar. And I think the issue with zero carbon is that it doesn't state what it's referring to. I always ask the question, zero carbon what? And I think that's really, really important. Because much like I said over this diagram, when you dig down into it, zero carbon at the minute isn't particularly about the stuff we consume from beyond the city's boundary, investments beyond the city's boundary, transport beyond the city's boundary, or waste disposed of beyond the city's boundary. And I think there's a bit more room to make an impact on this and to put these a little bit more front and centre on the agenda. And I think this matters because what we measure tends to manage. Of course, there is work on sustainable consumption and production and on waste, but what I'm saying is it doesn't feature as heavily as the stuff around scope 1 and 2 on direct emissions and energy. At a UK level, I think this is quite important to consider. They've talked about stopping the UK's contribution to global warming and getting a net zero economy. But if you look at the economy, it is around an 80% service sector, which is typically often to do with things that we consume, which often comes from abroad. At a city level, this is often more problematic. We tend to bring stuff in from outside of the city's borders. So it's increasingly a problematic picture to talk about the idea of a zero carbon economy without taking account of the impact of investment and consumption too. Now the final point I want to make relates to those kind of net zero or carbon neutral target dates. So 2050, 2038, debates about bringing it forward to 2030 or 2025. And I think the idea of a budget is really important to consider in relation to this. I think that it is important the day that we go zero carbon. Ideally, we probably want it to be sooner, but this has got to be given second priority to the budget and the total amount of emissions that are taking place in that time. And I'm going to try and make the case why. So again, for the backdrop, the budget for Greater Manchester that's been set is around 71 million tonnes of CO2. Again, this is around our direct emissions and stuff from energy. And for Manchester, the Tyndall Centre said we're allowed to remit 15 million tonnes of CO2. And they've said this is our fair part in keeping temperature increases below 2 degrees. Of course, as you remember, Kevin Anderson at Tyndall Centre doesn't particularly think that 1.5 degrees is still possible for us The important point to make is that neither of these rely on these negative emissions technologies, which some other carbon budgets do. Now, of course, as we know, they set the end date to go zero carbon, but what I think matters more is this bit under the graph. I've said to you the thing that's important is what carbon hangs around in the atmosphere. So what we do in the near term is just as important as the date that we go zero carbon. So that's the really, really crucial bit down there, and I hope I can demonstrate why by looking a little bit to the past. So between 2005 and 2020, the City of Manchester had a different target. The first target was that we would reduce emissions by 41% against 2005 levels by 2020. And it's looking like they're probably going to do that. So that's kind of the equivalent of your kind of end year target. By 2020, we're going to reduce emissions by 41%. That's probably going to happen. But the issue is that at the time, this translated to a cumulative emissions budget of around 42 million tonnes of CO2. And because we went over the kind of straight line down to that 41% so much, we're going to have to make more of a reduction by 2020 in order to stay within that amount of CO2. So whilst we might hit 41% in 2020, we probably, at the minute, aren't going to hit that target there. We're probably going to be a few million tonnes over there. And it's interesting that I'm seeing people hook onto this 41% target, because I think that this is the more important number, and this is the thing that we're probably not going to hit. So, if we now think forwards to the future, imagine if, as has been requested, we managed to go zero carbon in 2030. I think there's a lot of pressure for that at the minute. So thinking for Manchester here, not Greater Manchester. Tyndall have said that we've got 15 million tonnes of CO2. I reckon we could completely blow that budget while still going zero carbon in 2030. It would still require an unprecedented rate of emissions reductions, but it is completely feasible that we could go on for the next few years emitting around 2 million tonnes of CO2, and then maybe get our act together a little bit later and go zero carbon for 2030. But I really want to stress this, that scenario is a lot worse for global warming, for the environment, than if we took until 2050 and used that 15 million tonnes of CO2 really, really slowly. So my big message is here that if we want to reduce Manchester's impact on the planet, and to maybe allow people that don't have as many historical emissions as we do to maybe release a little bit more, we maybe want to question that 15 million tonnes of CO2 figure. If we can bring that down to 10, that would allow, again, a difficult, I know I recognise people's faces straight away, but that would allow a bit more leeway for elsewhere. I think that's probably the more important conversation to have. Are we happy with 15 million tonnes of CO2? Do we want to emit a bit less? It looks likely that we're going to struggle with 15 million tonnes. So I think that's the space that we need to be talking in, rather than the end year budgets. And I say that quite cautiously because I know there is a lot of goodwill to bring that target earlier, but I think this is a really, really significant thing to focus on. So yeah, I think focus on the overall budget. Should it be less? And focus on year-on-year reductions. We need to be hitting some pretty significant reductions year-on-year in order to stay within that 15 million tonnes. So I think focus on the near term, that's the important thing. So I'm going to be quick now because I'm on 7, which was my time that I set myself. I also want to remark that externalities matter too. I've stressed there's different ways of understanding the footprint, different things we can consider. Everything there and there is about direct emissions, and stuff to do with energy. I've said consumption matters, I've also stressed aviation. That's the area that I've worked on the most. Now, when the Tyndall Centre came up with that 15 million tonnes of CO2 budget and the equivalent for Greater Manchester, they made certain assumptions about what happens to aviation in the future. The big one is that aviation emissions will stay stable from now until 2032 and then decrease linearly until 2075. So, if Manchester's carbon budget is really to be as science-based as it is made now, and is to hold, aviation emissions have to follow suit. So emissions from Manchester Airport, from passenger use of planes wherever over the UK, cannot increase between now and 2032, or the city's budget no longer makes sense. So I've given the figures there, both for Manchester and the UK. So I think that's something to think about too. So again, stressing this other levers thing. Action on aviation, shipping, investment, consumption, and travel beyond the city is absolutely vital. And we've got to get a handle on these other levers of change if we are to make any meaningful action. So to wrap up, I've argued our carbon footprint is a way of taking stock of our emissions responsibility. Many people have a hand in the production of emissions all over the planet, so there's no one correct way of measuring them. The metaphor I've given here is that a footprint doesn't look like a boot. We typically measure direct emissions and those associated with energy use. I've talked about carbon budgets as an attempt to plan what carbon we use when, to limit the buildup of carbon in the atmosphere. So this is kind of like a carbon diet plan. I've argued that we need to focus on year-on-year emission reductions rather than just target dates, consider both. And I think we really need to consider those other levers of change, such as consumption, travel, aviation, and investment. And that is it from me. I'm more than happy to take any questions now if there's anything I can help with, but the thing that I'm really keen on is we can all have a bit of a chat, because I think that's probably the more valuable thing. So thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Joe. I mean, I think you did the quite remarkable thing. You were both clear and comprehensive. Yeah, thank you. However, people may have, I suppose, some burning questions of really about clarification. Thinking that in terms of the discussion we're going to have